Hi guys, Megan here. It's good to see you. Forgive the dark circles under my eyes. I don't know what time you are watching this, but for me it's after a long day of work. so so I'm looking a little like a zombie. Um, and I appreciate that you showed up, and I hope that you enjoy our lesson for today. We are in chapter 29. Page 265 if you have your books with you. The story today, if you are wondering where in the Bible you can find our story, you can look at Acts chapter 22, verse 30, through chapter 24, verse 27. I'll repeat that because it was kind of a mouthful. So Acts chapter 22:30 to 24:27 is where you will find our story today in the book of Acts. If you notice, we are slowly creeping to the end of the book of Acts, which is very exciting. We have a fun new curriculum coming up, but I appreciate that you've stuck with it so far in the book of Acts. So the who is God in our story today, you can find it at the top, is God is the judge. And the lesson theme is that God protects his people from the injustices of the world. The Old Testament and the New Testament revealed, if you look at the bottom of page 265, comes from the book of Ezekiel in the Old Testament. Ezekiel 13:10 through 16. So if you want to follow along, I'm going to read that right now. When a flimsy wall is built, they cover it with whitewash. Therefore, tell those who cover it with whitewash that it is going to fall. I will tear down the wall you have covered with whitewash. When it falls, you will be destroyed in it, and you will know that I am the Lord. So the prophet Ezekiel in this particular passage said that false prophets who led God's people away from the Lord by words were like flimsy whitewashed walls. So we're talking about false prophets as in people who said that they knew what God wanted they knew what God's will was, but they were actually just lying to the people to get their own way, which isn't great. And God was not happy with false prophets. So the prophet Ezekiel was going into this context. So Ezekiel said the Lord would destroy their flimsy wall. And in a similar way, if you look in Acts chapter 23, verse 3, Paul compared the high priest to a flimsy whitewashed wall. So what does Paul mean by this? Paul meant that the high priest looked good in his outward appearance. He looked really great. But he and the entire Sanhedrin, or the ruling body of the Jews, had a leadership that was weak, unstable, and soon to fall as the result of God's judgment. So they looked really great and they pretended to say all the right things, but in fact they were kind of a flimsy wall that was unsupported. And that's kind of the point that Paul is making in our story today. So I'm going to invite you to turn to page 266 in your book, and we are going to dig into that story today. The title is A Close Escape in a Long Imprisonment. It was a close call that Paul had the day before. Amidst angry Jewish voices screaming, "Get rid of that man!" and clouds of dust swirling through the crowds, the Roman commander intervened and ordered Paul to be taken to the barracks for his own safety. But the danger wasn't over yet. In a dark corner somewhere in Jerusalem, Paul's enemies were secretly plotting against him. The next day, Commander Claudius Lysias ordered a meeting of the Sanhedrin. If you remember, that's the ruling body of the Jews. He wanted to find out exactly why the Jews were accusing Paul. Standing before the Pharisees and Sadducees, Paul said confidently, "My brothers, in good conscience, I have done my duty to God up to this day." So, if you remember, The commander had put Paul in the barracks at the Antonia fortress to keep him safe from a mob that wanted to kill him. So in the morning, he gave Paul freedom, but he wanted to know what Paul had said or done to incite such an intense riot from the Jews the day before. They had acted crazy, and because he didn't speak the language Paul was speaking, he didn't understand what he was saying. So even though the Sanhedrin Jews had civil and religious authority over the Jews, while existing side by side with the Roman authorities, so if you remember, Jerusalem was technically ruled by Rome, but the Sanhedrin had authority of the Jews in Jerusalem and the area around it. But the Roman commander could convene the Sanhedrin whenever he wanted. So even though they were a ruling body, the commander that had put Paul to safety was technically able to call them whenever he wanted. So whenever the commander, so this human that was in essence kind of saving Paul, believed that the interests of the Roman Empire were at stake, he had jurisdiction over the Jewish court. So when he was like, oh no, things are happening and Rome might be in trouble, the commander would be like, I want to talk to the Sanhedrin. Even though the Sanhedrin was full of really important people, this commander person was technically above them. That was a lot, but I hope you followed along. So in the story, when the commander, it says that he called a meeting with the Sanhedrin, and you're being like, but the Sanhedrin are like full of super important people, Megan. How in the world did the commander call them together? It's because technically the commander supported Rome, and Rome had the authority over them. That is why. So I'm going to continue. Thanks for sticking along with that slight rabbit trail, but I hope it makes a little bit more sense. Paul said confidently, my brothers, in good conscience, I have done my duty to God up to this day. Smack! The high priest ordered those next to Paul to slap him across the mouth. God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, Paul said. You judge me against the law, while you break the law by having me slapped. In shock, those standing near, Paul said, do you dare insult God's high priest? Paul quickly apologized. I didn't know he was the high priest. The scriptures say, do not speak evil of the ruler of your people. Then, knowing that there were both Sadducees and Pharisees in the crowd, and wanting to provoke a controversy, Paul said, I am a Pharisee and the son of a Pharisee. I stand on trial because I have hope in the resurrection. With those words, a vehement dispute broke out. There was no better way to start an argument between the two groups of men, the Pharisees, who believed in the resurrection, and the Sadducees, who didn't. Some of the Pharisees shouted out, we find nothing wrong with this man. The argument was so fierce that the commander thought that once again Paul was in danger of being torn apart by the angry Jewish leaders. Forcefully, the soldiers whisked Paul away from the fighting mob and took him back to the soldiers' barracks. So, a little bit of a nerdy point here. The Greek word used here for dispute, like the Pharisees and Sadducees were super angry, is the word meant for dissension. And it actually means dissension in Greek. So the argument that rose between the Sadducees and Pharisees that our story today is talking about was intense and became physically violent. We're talking about like violent, angry mob throwing punches type of deal. This was a huge deal. So rightfully the commander was like, oh goodness, I better get Paul away from these people because he might get hurt. What might Paul have been thinking? Did he wonder if he would get out of Jerusalem alive or even be able to preach the gospel in Rome? Late that night, while Paul was all alone in the cold stone barracks, the Lord Jesus appeared to him. Have courage, the Lord said. You have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you will testify of me in Rome as well." Conspiracy simmered in the city. 40 men vowed not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. They went to the Sanhedrin with a fiendish plan and said, "We have taken an oath not to eat or drink until we kill Paul. In the morning we want you to request of the commander that Paul be brought to the temple so you can question him again. We are prepared to kill him along the way." Somehow Paul's nephew heard of this plot and went to the barracks to tell Paul. Paul then said to one of the centurions, "Take this young man to the commander. He has important news to tell him." The commander took the news seriously. He called together 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. Then he wrote a letter to Governor Felix in the capital city of Caesarea Maritima. "Claudius Lysias, to his Excellency Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews. They were about to kill him when I rescued him, for I learned he was a Roman citizen. After taking him to the Sanhedrin, I learned that the accusation had to do with Jewish law, and there was no charge worthy of death. When I heard of a plot against him, I decided to send him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present their case against him to you." In the darkness of night, the military caravan left Jerusalem. They stopped at Antipus the first day, and from there the soldiers returned to Jerusalem. The cavalry and Paul continued on to Caesarea. In Caesarea, Governor Felix read the letter and said, "I will hear your case when your accusers come." He put Paul under guard in Herod's palace. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias and some Jewish elders came to Caesarea. Determined to win this case, the Jewish leaders brought with them Tertullus, a lawyer with a thorough knowledge of Roman law. Tertullus began his case with lavish praise for the governor. "We have enjoyed a long time of peace and good reforms under your rule. Most excellent Felix, we have great gratitude for all you have done." Pausing for a moment, this praise of Felix was purely flattery, because Felix, more than other procurators, was brutal and harsh towards the Jews, so he wasn't really a great guy to begin with. So I'm gonna drop that context for a second. So this was kind of a formality. He wasn't actually a fantastic human. Then he proceeded to make accusations against Paul. He said Paul was a troublemaker, stirring up riots all over the world and desecrating the Jerusalem temple. The Jewish leaders agreed, saying, "Yes, all of these things about Paul are true." In his defense, Paul spoke confidently. "I gladly make my defense before you, Governor Felix. You can easily verify that I did not argue with anyone in the temple or stir up any trouble in the synagogue or anywhere else in the city, and no one can prove any of the charges they make against me." Paul continued his defense, explaining how their charges couldn't be true. He said that if the Jews in Asia had charges against them, they should present them in person. He summarized the situation with these words: "What crime could the Sanhedrin find in me except that I stood in the middle of a temple and said, 'It is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I stand on trial today'?" Governor Felix was acquitted with the sect called the Way. Governor Felix was acquainted with the sect called the Way, or the beginning of the Christian church. And they had no reputation of being rebellious against the Roman government or riotous in any way. In his mind, the members of the Sanhedrin hadn't proved any good reason to turn Paul over to them for trial. He dismissed everyone and said to Paul, "When Commander Lysias comes to Caesarea, I'll talk to him and decide your case." He put Paul under guard, but gave him some freedom and allowed his friends to bring him food and other things he would need. Several days later, Felix called for Paul, accompanied by his Jewish wife, Drusilla. Felix listened as Paul talked about his Christian faith. Paul talked about the importance of being righteous and having self-control, and about being judged by God, the righteous judge. Felix had been curious about the Christian faith, but when Paul confronted him and Drusilla about their sins and warned them of God's judgment, they didn't want to hear anything more. Afraid, Felix said, "That's enough for now. When it's convenient, I'll call for you again." For some reason, Felix thought that Paul might offer him a bribe so that he would be released from prison. So Felix called for Paul often. But Paul never offered Felix a bribe, and Felix never repented and believed in Jesus. Thus began Paul's 2-year imprisonment in Caesarea Maritima. So, that is where we leave our story today. Paul is imprisoned in Caesarea Maritima for 2 years because he wouldn't take a bribe, or he wouldn't bribe Felix for his release, because Paul was an honorable man, even if the proconsul Felix was not. So I am going to leave us there for today. I hope you learned something. I hope that I see you next week. As always, you are free to contact me with questions or with really anything. My email is mmckinnis@spu.edu. I don't know why I had to think about that. mmckinnis@spu.edu is my email. You are always free to contact me with questions or comments or just to say hi. And I will see you all next week. Have a good one.